Okay. Okay. Hey, good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Alyssa Yapel, and this is our first in a series of a webinar series of animal adaptations. So I am here with my awesome coworkers, Jen Dennison from the Division of Wildlife and Jamie Emmert. Jamie is going to present here shortly, but I just quickly wanted to review the plan that we have going forward on these topics. So Jamie is going to talk about awesome adaptations of animals in grasslands areas. And then coming up next week on June 17th, we have awesome adaptations of animals in wetlands. And then June 24th is forests, and July 1st is rivers and streams. So hope to see you in the future joining us. And if you want to ask questions today, please use the Q&A box. Ask us anything, and we will try to do our best to answer. So Jen's going to be helping me with questions today, and I'm going to pass it on to Jamie now to start the presentation.
Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Again, my name is Jamie, and I work for the Ohio Division of Wildlife in Akron. That's our District 3 office for Northeast Ohio. We cover 19 counties, and so I've been at that district office for 17 years now, and I've been in the same position for 17 years because I love it that much. And I spend a great deal of time educating folks, just as yourselves, about wildlife in Ohio. So this is a really great opportunity to talk about critters that are specific to grasslands. And if you, like Alyssa said, have questions along the way, we'll do our best to accommodate you. And then I'll stick around at the end as long as Alyssa and Jen allows me to have conversations and answer questions. So ready to get started? All right. How's that look? Might take a second.
I don't see it yet, Jamie.
Okay. Well,
you might want to stop sharing the other one and then just try sharing again.
Okay, I'll give that a try. Thank you.
Okay. There we go.
All right. Can you see my first slide, my opening slide?
Yep.
All right, now we're in business. All right, so for the next 30 minutes or so, and I'm going to ask Alyssa and Jen to keep an eye on the time to help me out, because I will talk all day about wildlife given the opportunity. And I know you have many better things to do than to listen to me go on all day long, especially as beautiful as it is outside. So I'm going to make the best of our next 30 minutes together and talk about adaptations and habitats and how we describe those things, and about grasslands in Ohio, what makes them that kind of habitat and why they're special to us and to wildlife. And we'll talk specifically about a few species that you might see here in Ohio that specifically uses grassland habitat. And then also at the end, we'll quickly cover how you can help support the protection of grasslands and the wildlife that uses these special habitats. Sound good? So think about for a moment how you would describe what an adaptation is. Think of a trait or something that helps an animal to what? To survive or reproduce, perhaps. Think of an animal and a specific characteristic that might help it survive and to have young and help them survive. Do you think a badger penguin has an interesting adaptation? Now, this isn't a real species in this image, it's photoshopped, but it's interesting to think about, right? Can a badger penguin survive? So the American badger head on a penguin body, it's interesting, right? But animals really do have pretty special adaptations to help them survive. Whether it's the way that they act or the way that they look, it still qualifies. So maybe it's a body part or a body covering, such as fur or a behavior. So all of those types of things are adaptations, and we'll break it down much further in just a few minutes to make it clearer. So moving on, what is a habitat? How do you describe what a habitat is? Not necessarily grassland, but just in general. So now that you've thought about it for a second, it's basically home, just like for humans. Hopefully our homes provide the things that we need to survive, just fundamental, basic things to make us comfortable enough to survive. So where we live produces things that we all need, human and wildlife alike. So think about, what are those things? There's 4 basic things that animals and humans as well need to survive well and comfortably. So name them off, and it doesn't matter what order. I have them in no specific order, but did you think about food? About water? We all need water, especially, right? We can go a few days, maybe not comfortably, but we can go a few days without food, but not without water. And shelter, a roof over our heads to protect us from the weather, from the elements. And then this is one that a lot of us tend to forget or take for granted: space. So if you have to live in a very confined space and you don't have a lot of room, are you going to be comfortable? Are you going to do well? Especially if you don't feel well, or another member of your household doesn't feel well, and you have nowhere to go. Space is just as important for wildlife too. They have territories. Some are small territories, some are large territories, but those 4 things are really important for wildlife and humans to survive comfortably. So in habitats, hopefully they can successfully find those things. What do you think makes a grassland habitat different than, say, a forest habitat or a wetland habitat? It's pretty obvious, right? Grasses. So most grasslands, and we'll get into names of other of this type of habitat. You may hear grasslands called something else. We'll get into that in just a second. But it's basically a treeless habitat. Trees don't survive very well in grassland habitats. Trees need a lot of rainfall, a lot of moisture to grow big and strong, where grasses can get by with a lot less. And they have their specialized soils. You might see flowers in these grasslands. So you can refer to grasslands as prairies or pastures, hay fields, meadows, and farm fields. They're all very similar. And in Ohio, we have those types of grasslands, but there's many different names around the world depending on where you go. So you can see here that there's grasslands nearly everywhere on the globe. No matter where you go on the planet, with exception to Antarctica, you're going to find maybe in Africa a savanna, or in South America, pampas, steppes in Europe and Asia, prairies or grasslands here in North America, and in Australia, you would call them rangelands. About a quarter of the planet is covered in grasslands. They're very important ecosystems. Not only do they provide plants on the food, the water, the shelter, and the space for an assortment of wildlife, they're drought resistant, so these plants can last through really hot summers where there's not a lot of rain. They can last through the winter during the most brutal winter storms. The roots of these plants go deep into the soil, and so it's not easy to kill these plants. And because of these deep root systems, they help prevent erosion during flooding, so they keep soil in place, and they help absorb water, so there's not standing water all the time. And in this particular case, different from wetlands, these plants don't survive in standing water long. So they will absorb water down into the soil. And very importantly for the health of us, as well as the wildlife and plants on this planet, is that they store loads of carbon dioxide, just like trees. They're able to absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and make it a cleaner, healthy environment for all of us. So let's dive into adaptations, because that's what we're here specifically to talk about. So adaptations of wildlife. And these are some of the things to keep in mind when you think about what adaptations, what wildlife has as far as adaptations for grassland environments. Speed. So not here in Ohio or even in North America, but you might be familiar with an African species called a gazelle. And they're one of the fastest land mammals. They can run at speeds that will just blow your mind away. And so that's their adaptation to be able to evade predators. Here in Ohio, we have a similar species, a long distant relative, the white-tailed deer. Those long legs help their stride be very distant. They can go at strong, powerful speeds and evade predators. So that's their best, one of their best ways to avoid predators and to flee is to run as fast as they can. So some species also depend on nesting behavior. So songbirds, where do you think songbirds nest in grasslands? Sometimes when we think of a songbird nest, we may automatically picture a big oak tree, for instance. We don't find oak trees in grasslands. So where do you suppose songbirds nest? On the ground amongst the grasses. They camouflage their nests in the grasses. And speaking of camouflage, a lot of species depend on blending in, right? And camouflage, what color is camouflage? Think about that for a second. Do you think of earth tones like greens and browns? That's where my head goes right away. But camouflage is the environment. So maybe an insect that wants to hide amongst really beautiful, brightly colored wildflowers might be pink or green to blend in, bright green, not an earth tone that we are familiar with as camouflage, like the dark greens. So there's colors across the spectrum that qualify as camouflage, and patterns too. And look at this leopard frog in the picture here. Look at all the different textures and shapes and colors on this beautiful frog to help it blend in with its environment. Now, you may not know what I mean by social systems, but a lot of wildlife species depend on safety in numbers. So some species will behave strictly solo, and they are rarely around other individuals of their kind, and they're very independent. But some animals will find safety in numbers, and especially during the colder months out of the year, like European starlings, which are a type of bird, they'll gather in large numbers. And that way, if they are chased by a predator, their chances of survival are greater. If you look at Africa, for instance, you might have seen pictures or watched TV and seen zebras, where there's lots and lots of them. And their patterns in these large numbers help them blend in with each other, and then predators get confused. And this happens with frogs too, because when they're all together, they will look like one big animal or multiple animals instead of small individuals. Hope that makes sense. If anybody needs me to clarify on that, please let Alyssa or Jen know. Burrowing behavior. You know what burrowing is? Digging. So digging down into the ground and hiding in the ground, nesting in the ground. And we'll break that down in just a second, talk about species that depend on burrowing behaviors. And hunting styles. Some species that hunt other individuals, animals, or plants to survive have different techniques. So if a predator is hunting another animal, perhaps they sneak and ambush their prey, or maybe they just chase it down. And because they're so strong and they're powerful and they can go on for a long time and wear their species out. So many different hunting styles will help an animal to survive in its environment. So are these species that use Ohio grasslands to survive? These aren't real species either. I'm just playing. But if you did have to try to figure out what these species entail, look at the picture on the left. Is that a tiger mixed with a polar bear? You're not going to see those in a grassland in Ohio. And what about the one on the right? Those are some weird adaptations to qualify as a species. Can you figure out what the animal that's supposed to, or what two animals it's supposed to be? You see the kangaroo ears and the big, strong hind legs of the kangaroo that helps it evade predators. And then what's that face and the mane that goes around the head? An African lion. Just a little bit of fun, but let's look at the real deal now. So there's so many species. countless number of species that can depend on and do depend on grasslands in Ohio. And I'm going to talk about each of these species. These are just examples that I've chosen to be good representations of animals that we can talk about today. So let's look at grasses. They're specially evolved to live in our climates, and let's look specifically here in the Buckeye State at Ohio. We have a pretty neutral climate. It gets pretty hot in the summer, and we complain about how cold it gets in the winter, but it's really not nearly as brutal of winters as some other parts of our country and other parts of the world experience. But still, it can be pretty tough to survive. And so these grasses that you see here in the image are specifically designed to excel in grassland environments. So these grasses have long, skinny leaves, and they don't evaporate moisture as fast as, say, trees with big, wide leaves. So when the sun is beating down on these leaves, they can keep moisture and retain moisture for long periods of time, helping them live longer throughout droughts. And I mentioned earlier that root system that goes deep down into the soil, into the ground, that will help them survive through really brutal weather too. There's several species that depend on grasslands directly to survive, and in this case, specifically for food. Do you recognize this creature? This is a member of the rodent family known as a meadow vole. And biologists like to have fun, and we refer to them as little meadow sausages or field sausages. They're very fat. They're little squatty creatures. They're small, about the size of a chipmunk or so. And they burrow down into the ground, and that's where they have their nests. And they can survive extreme heat and extreme cold by staying in the ground where they're much safer. And this is how they evade predators. And they don't need a lot of water to survive. They get a lot of their moisture from the grasses that they eat. Another critter that depends directly on grasses is the grasshopper. So they eat grasses to survive. And they also have a very cool technique to evade predators. So a meadow vole will burrow down into the ground and run in these complex tunnel systems to stay safe. What do you think the grasshopper does to avoid predators? I bet you're saying it right now. They jump, they hop great distances. They can catapult themselves so far, and so far is about 30 inches. So the stride of an adult walking forward, for instance, that's about 30 inches. And it may not sound like much, but think about a little 2-inch grasshopper. 30 inches is a pretty big deal. If I, for instance, could jump relative to my body size compared to a grasshopper, I could jump the distance of a football field. So this really helps them flee from predators very successfully. Male grasshoppers have wings, and they can fly short distances, but hopping away, jumping away is where it's at. So here are some more creatures that we have in Ohio. And let's look at the bottom left-hand corner. Is that a barn owl? We have barn owls throughout the state, and you will specifically most likely see them where you'll find grasslands or prairies. And they depend greatly on eating rodents, such as the meadow vole. Barn owls are just extraordinary hunters. They, just like many other owl species, they have offset ears. And this really helps them hear from a 360-degree direction, all directions, all around them. They can listen for noises and listen for scurrying meadow voles and other similar creatures that they're hunting. And can you look closely at the screen and see that disc around its face? These are feathers that project different directions to create this facial disc. So when they're listening, and they can see well too, but they really depend on the quality of sound that they're able to capture. That facial disc will absorb that sound, and they can really hone in on exactly where that animal is as they're flying low over the grasses and quietly hunting. Their feathers make little to no noise, so they can sneak up on their prey. So it's just amazing. And they have some of the most impressive ability to listen to sound as any animal on the planet. They have such sensitive hearing that they can literally hear a pin if it were to drop and hit the floor. So they could hear a meadow vole scurrying around in the grasses and hone in as they're flying low over the grasses and drop on an unsuspecting prey. The other animal that I brought up below the picture of the grasshopper is one that isn't as well known and not as widespread, but we're seeing more of these critters pop up in areas like cemeteries and golf courses where there's mowed grass. They like grass, but they like it short. They feel safer and they can still survive there and find what they need to survive comfortably. This is called a 13-lined ground squirrel. And if you look closely, and you can't exactly see all 13 lines in this picture, but you can see the stripes down its back from its head to its tail, and in between the stripes is a pattern of little tiny squares or dots. And this helps them camouflage themselves in the grasses. It breaks up their outline and makes it tough for predators to see them. They eat grasses and they eat lots of vegetation throughout the winter, but they don't like to come out in the winter because it's so cold and it's hard to get to grasses when the snow is on the ground. So they're able to collect lots of grasses in the nicer weather, in the warmer months, and store it in their cheek pouches. So it's like carrying a little basket on their heads. They're able to put the grasses in their cheek pouches and carrying them back to their dens underneath the ground, and they'll store the grasses in there, and they'll do this all summer long and stock up. So in the winter, while they're hibernating, if they wake up hungry, they can depend on these grasses. Or if there's a stretch of really nasty weather during the summer months, say a lot of rain and it doesn't make it really comfortable for them to be able to eat, they can eat these stored grasses that they've kept underground. Pretty clever. Can you tell what's in this next picture? I bet you can guess it's a snake, right? One of our many amazing reptiles in Ohio. This is a specifically very endangered, critically endangered snake that you're probably not going to encounter in Ohio for a couple of reasons. Its population is pretty small. There's not very many of them, which is why they're endangered. They're in really wet grasslands, really wet meadows so much of the time. This is in eastern Massasauga. And eastern Massasaugas like to be in places where there's lots of moisture because they like to eat things like meadow voles, that we talked about a minute ago, and they'll eat 13-line ground squirrels too. So they'll come out of these wet meadows into drier grasslands and cut grasses to hunt sometimes. And so they depend on rodents within the grasslands to survive. And one of their neat adaptations to be able to capture prey is to wiggle their tail. Since they're rattlesnakes, they do indeed have rattles at the end. They'll shake those rattles to warn other animals, other predators, that they're a rattlesnake, and they don't want to fight. They're very docile creatures, which means that they're not friendly, but they aren't ready to fight typically. They just want to be left alone. And this goes for humans too. They aren't typically ones to strike and bite right away, and they just have to be bothered. So their adaptation to avoid being hurt or killed is just to freeze. But if they feel too threatened, they'll rattle that tail to warn predators that they don't want to get involved. However, they will also shake that tail and just shake the very tip of it really lightly if prey is going by. And sometimes, like 13-line ground squirrels, will see the tip of the tail shivering and be curious about it. And they'll come closer and wonder what they're looking at. They're not quite sure because the rest of the snake is so camouflaged and holding still that they don't see that snake sitting in the grass. They just see the tip of the tail shaking. And so that prey will get a little bit closer and a little bit closer in order to get a better look at what they see moving. They think maybe it's an insect I want to eat, maybe it's a worm I want to eat. And then the snake is able to snatch up its lunch. You recognize this creature, another one that's not terribly common in Ohio? A lot of people are surprised that we do have these critters in small numbers. And they are in small numbers, just like the Massasauga and the 13-line ground squirrel, because grasslands aren't that abundant of an ecosystem in Ohio. We have forests and we have lots of development in Ohio. But these critters, this species, depends a lot on grasslands and similar environments. This is an American badger. So badgers will live in prairies, but also farm fields. and especially are drawn to abandoned farm fields where there's not a lot of activity, but very similar habitat. And badgers eat a lot of snakes. So as you can see, this is all connected. We have the grasses that feed the voles and the grasshoppers, and then those critters feed the owls and the ground squirrels and the snakes feed this American badger. And badgers are pretty extraordinary predators. They're very tough, they're very strong, they are fast, even though they're built like a football player. They're like a linebacker. They're very strong and stout and muscular. So they can run at top speeds and evade predators that way. And they'll dive into old groundhog holes, or they're very strong diggers. So they have long, sharp claws, and they can dig at amazing speeds and be able to evade predators that way to get down into the ground where it's safe. But they do eat a lot of snakes, and they're not scared of rattlesnakes. They have no problem being able to, because they're so quick and they're so clever that they can snatch up a rattlesnake without getting hurt very, very easily, especially compared to other predators, which is why they can eat rattlesnakes. And it goes full circle because they can eat grasshoppers too. Badgers will eat insects and worms and rodents. And so badgers will depend on almost all of these creatures that we just talked about. It would be hard for a badger to get a hold of a barn owl, but if it could, it would. Does anybody have any questions about those critters before we move on? All right. So grassland habitat is hard to find in Ohio. It hasn't always been that way. We had thousands of acres of grasslands, believe it or not, prior to the date of statehood. Does anybody know when Ohio became a state? It was in the 1800s, the early 1800s. You said 1803, you nailed it. And prior to 1803, Ohio was very, very different, mostly forest, but we did have a lot of grasslands, especially in the western part of the state and the northwestern part of the state. And grasslands are equally as important as these other habitats, just depending on the species that you're talking about. It's important to have a diversity of ecosystems so that our diversity of wildlife throughout the planet can exist comfortably. So grasslands, because of development for farm fields and for our homes and our highways, they were removed from the landscape and replaced with other types of systems. But we still have some grasslands in Ohio, so we need to support what we have left so that we can maintain. So how you can help is to support organizations like the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, who help conserve and preserve these lands. So it's important for us to enjoy them, and we can go to these public places and see these wild critters in action and these beautiful environments. Support legislation, talk to powerful leaders about what we should do in order to preserve what we have left and to conserve what we have left, and to continue learning. This is a great place to start. We're so pleased that you tuned in. You obviously care about wildlife and you care about habitats. So learn as much as you can and share that information with others. It's important to spread the word about how important grassland environments are to Ohio and around the world. And you can also volunteer. If you start to learn or you already know a lot about grasslands and species, you can there's a wide variety of ways to get involved in citizen science. So we can talk more about that if you want to talk about different applications and platforms and websites to be able to collect data, sightings, and to identify species of plants and wildlife, and then share that information so that we can learn more about these environments.
Hey, Jamie.
Yes, ma'am.
Somebody asked, what's your favorite animal adaptation?
Oh, wow. That's an excellent question and a tough one to answer because I'm so fascinated by so many, but I think about that for a second. The pressure. There's got to be, Give me just a second. Does anybody have an adaptation that they want to share with us while I'm thinking about this? Type it in and share it with Jen and Alyssa so we can talk about what your favorite adaptations are, because that's a really fun conversation.
Do you want me to ask one of the other questions? You can come back.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking about, it's pretty basic, but I can't but be just super impressed with white-tailed deer, because their eyesight is so amazing, and they're one of the first that I think of, because their eyes are so large for their heads, and so they have these enormous, beautiful eyes that can gather so much light, and they're active throughout the day. We all know that we've seen deer out during the daytime, and but they prefer to be active at dusk and dawn. And there's a special term for that called crepuscular. So these white-tailed deer tend to be crepuscular because they can see really well at these twilight hours, where a lot of species can't, because it's kind of an in-between where there's not much light yet, but there's still some light, and it can make it tough for predators to see during that time, because they may be more adapted to see during the nighttime hours, more receptive to collect as much light as possible and see in the darkness, which deer can do too, but they can see so well at dusk and dawn. And not to mention that their eyes are set almost on the sides of their head. If you've never really looked closely at a deer, which a lot of us haven't because we just see them all the time, that we forget to really appreciate them. So next time you see a deer, look at the placement of those eyes, and they're almost on the sides. And this allows them to see almost all the way around. So even if you wanted to, it would be really hard to creep up on and surprise a white-tailed deer, because they'll know you're coming. They have excellent sense of smell and hearing too, but the eyesight is just amazing.
Another question, somebody asked, what about the American kestrel? Do they live in grassland habitats?
Yes, indeed, an American kestrel. Gosh, that would have been a great species to highlight. It's tough to decide, and that's why I could talk all day about the fascinating creatures that we have, because just every animal is remarkable in and of itself, and kestrels truly are. Their numbers have declined over the years because of declining grassland acreages, and they depend a lot on hunting rodents, and they also have a very neat adaptation. They sit much of the time on telephone wires, and so they have actually benefited to some degree from human activity, because they hunt from these telephone wires. And so in a natural environment, they wouldn't be able to stay perched for very long in an open environment where there are very few, if any, trees, and so they would hover using a lot of energy, and they still hover. And what I mean by that is that if you look it up on YouTube, pull up a video of an American kestrel hunting, and you will see this really neat behavior where they will fly over a grassland, or they'll be sitting on a telephone wire, and they'll fly off of the wire and just hover over a spot, and they'll kind of shiver in place. You'll see them, and they'll be just holding so still, and then they'll just drop like a sack of potatoes. They'll just drop down to the grass, and they snatch up their prey that way. And the whole time that they're hovering, they can do this for minutes and minutes, and it takes an extraordinary amount of energy, and they can keep their heads perfectly still. And this is what you want to watch for in the video, is that their heads don't move. The rest of their body is moving to hold itself in place, but that head remains perfectly constant. And that will help them really hone in. And they're not actually looking for the rodent that they want to eat. They're looking for something to indicate where that rodent is. They know it's down there. So they have UV receptors in their eyes. This is a special adaptation that allows them to gather light, and it looks like highlighters. The trails look like highlighters, and those trails that they're looking for are urine trails from the rodents. So while these mice and voles and other creatures are running through the grasses in their little trails, they're doing their business, and they're leaving these little pee trails behind. And the kestrels can see those, like they've been lighted with a yellow highlighter. And then when they see the freshest, they know exactly where that animal just was, and then they'll see the movement and drop down and snatch it up. Incredible.
Jamie, you mentioned voles, and we actually had a question somebody was asking, I think, about a vole a meadow vole. They said, when do they come out? Hot days or cold days?
They prefer warm weather. So not necessarily hot. If it's too hot, they may stay underground because it's just going to be really hard on them to try and survive when it's really hot, because they're going to need more moisture, they're going to need more water. So they'll conserve their energy and maybe come out at night if it cools down, or just wait until the weather gets cooler. But in the spring and the nicer days of summer and through the fall, they're very, very active. And so they're 3/4 of the year, so say roughly 9 months or so out of the year, they're very, very active day after day. But in the winter, they'll tend to hibernate. So, and hibernate and torpor are two different things that we have a lot of wildlife species using to survive. So another adaptation. So hibernate is when an animal sleeps deeply for an extended period of time. And in Ohio, hibernation isn't really common. So you go further north into Canada and even further north than that, and the weather just gets really brutal, and it's hard for a lot of species to survive. They can't find the food to sustain, and it's just that those cold temperatures are too much to handle. So they'll hibernate, just sleep away the winter, which I'm sure many of us are wishing we could do the same. And then there's another type of sleep called torpor, Torpor. And torpor is where they'll sleep just during the worst weather. So many animals might be active throughout the winter, but if the blizzard blows in and it's just really nasty and the snow is super deep, then they may sleep for a week or a week and a half. And then when that passes by and the weather improves, then they'll come out of that sleep to continue and surviving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to read a couple of the viewers' favorite adaptations. Someone wrote, weaver birds are interesting because they weave together a large leaf, literally sewing it to make their nest. Somebody else wrote, hummingbirds use spider webs to make their nests, which helps it expand as the baby birds grow. And then Melissa wrote in and said, squirrels' back feet rotate 180 degrees, which means they can turn from completely forward to completely backward.
They look like little gymnasts in the trees. Now you know why.
So a couple other questions before we wrap it up. What is the most difficult habitat for animals to survive in?
Depends on the species. If you were to ask me what's the most difficult habitat for me to survive in, I would tell you full and well it's the North Pole. But you'd ask a polar bear that, and the polar bear would be like, what are you talking about? This is totally paradise. So I guess it depends on the species that you're talking about, whether it's the prairies or the forests or the desert. You're not going to be able to take a forest dwelling species like a porcupine, for instance, which we have just a few of on our eastern border in Ohio, probably from our neighboring Pennsylvania. You can't take a porcupine and put it in the Arizona desert and expect it to survive. There's not the right food there for it, not enough water, and it's just too darn hot. But if you take, and same if you take it a lizard that lives in the Southwest desert and you put it in a Pennsylvania forest habitat, it's not going to survive the cold temperatures, and it's not going to necessarily find the food that it needs. So some species can adapt better than others, and we see that in common species in urban environments. We have a tendency to think, well, so much wildlife is suffering because of development, for instance, and lack of habitat. And to some extent that's true. And we need to help conserve and preserve much of the habitat that we have left throughout the world. But that being said, species like white-tailed deer and raccoons and coyotes, these are species that are actually thriving amongst humans. Canada geese, I'm betting that you see dozens of those nearly on a daily basis if you live in an environment where there's water nearby, because they can tolerate humans. But you can't say that for every species, so it's just different across the board.
Okay, so somebody said, I heard about a caterpillar that tries to look like bird poop to hide from predators, which I think is pretty strange. What is the strangest adaptation you've heard of?
Oh, wow. I would have to say a classic example is the platypus. I don't even understand what's going on there. So we have this species in Australia that has a duck-like bill. It has fur, light, thin fur on its body. It has feet like a duck to help it swim, and it lays eggs, but it's warm-blooded. It feeds milk to its babies. It has venomous little horns on its ankles, I think, to help ward off predators. So they are just a miracle and hard for biologists to explain. So they have a lot of adaptations on a tiny little body and manage to survive quite well.
Awesome. Okay, last question is, your job seems pretty cool. What do you do day to day, and how do you get to work for the Division of Wildlife?
I do have a cool job. I'm very fortunate. I have a lot of variety, and that's what works for me. And I think that's why I've been in this job for so long, is that I can't get tired of it. So, it's pretty awesome to be able to speak to fine folks such as yourselves about wildlife. I'm a nature lover through and through. I grew up in the outdoors and have been a nature lover all my life. And so I want everyone to love wildlife and the outdoors as much as me. So any opportunity I have to share it in any shape or form is great. And so presenting is something that I do often to people of all ages. So I drive around Northeast Ohio and sometimes the state giving programs upon request, but I also work at trade shows. So there's maybe the Cleveland Home and Garden Show. I'll spend some time there in February talking to people about wildlife, and then I'll go to a county fair in the late summer. Under normal circumstances, I would work at a display and talk about wildlife. And I write articles for newspapers and for Wild Ohio magazine. And I answer the phone a lot, answering questions over the phone for people who are maybe experiencing problems with wildlife and they're trying to fix those problems. Maybe they saw a black bear and they're calling to ask if it's okay to have a black bear in their neighborhood and what to do about it. So there's a lot of different things that I do. I especially enjoy doing workshops to train other educators who want to teach others about wildlife. I help connect them with resources so that they can then share it with others. And so then we get our biggest bang for the buck that way. But yeah, I do have a pretty sweet job.
Awesome. Jen, do you have anything to add, or if not, I was going to wrap it up.
Nope, sounds good. Thanks,
Okay.
Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Jen. Thanks for everybody that watched and asked questions today. And just a reminder, awesome adaptations about animals in the wetlands is June 17th. Forest is June 24th. And on July 1st will be rivers and streams. So keep an eye out for more info on those on Facebook and Twitter. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.